Lewis Hamilton spent the entire April break inside Ferrari's simulator at Maranello. Hundreds of laps, setup after setup, fine-tuning the car for Miami with the most expensive simulation rig money can buy. Then he got to the Miami International Autodrome, drove the actual car, and the setup was so far off he had to throw everything out between the sprint and qualifying. At least, that is what everyone thought worked. Hamilton had a different theory. The simulator itself was the problem, and he is ready to stop using it. Nobody was paying attention to the simulator narrative on Friday morning in Miami. Ferrari had just topped the only practice session of the weekend. Charles Leclerc set the fastest time, roughly 3/10 clear of Max Verstappen's Red Bull. Hamilton was fourth. The team had arrived carrying 11 new components, more than any rival that weekend. A completely new rear wing nicknamed the Macarena, designed to improve both cornering load and the efficiency of the drag reduction system. The paddock consensus was clear. Ferrari had done serious work during the April break. The upgrades looked real. That consensus lasted about 6 hours. Sprint qualifying on Friday evening exposed a car that had two completely different personalities depending on which side of the garage you were standing on. Hamilton's Ferrari locked its front wheels under braking, refused to rotate cleanly through the medium-speed corners, and slid wide at exactly the moments the simulator had told him the car would grip. He finished sprint qualifying 7th, over 7/10 slower than pole sitter Lando Norris in the McLaren. Leclerc, running the identical upgrade package, qualified 4th. A small gap separated them on paper, roughly 1/10 of a second. A canyon separated them in feel. Hamilton did not sugarcoat it. The car was not what he had hoped for. The overnight gap between sprint qualifying and the Grand Prix qualifying session on Saturday afternoon was all he had to work with. The sprint race on Saturday morning did not help. Hamilton fought a wheel-to-wheel battle with Verstappen, but came out on the wrong side, finishing 7th, 21 seconds behind sprint winner Norris. Meanwhile, Leclerc took 3rd after applying late pressure to Oscar Piastri in the closing laps. And then Hamilton made the decision that changed his entire weekend. Between the sprint and qualifying, Hamilton and his side of the Ferrari garage threw out the setup the Maranello simulator had recommended and rebuilt the car from a fundamentally different starting point. Different springs, different damper settings, different ride height philosophy. The configuration that rolled out of the garage for qualifying on Saturday afternoon was miles different from the sprint, miles different from Friday, miles different from what the simulator had told him to run. It worked. Hamilton qualified 6th, still behind Leclerc in 3rd, still half a second off Andrea Kimi Antonelli's pole position for Mercedes, but 3 grid positions better than the sprint, and with a car that finally responded the way a racing car is supposed to respond. The balance that the simulator had promised but never delivered was suddenly there, once Hamilton stopped listening to the simulator and started listening to his own hands. The question was why it had been necessary in the first place. Hamilton's answer was direct. The sprint setup and the qualifying setup were miles apart, and if he had to choose between trusting the Maranello simulator and trusting his own feel for the car, the choice was obvious. The simulator, he said, really sent me in the wrong direction. He is thinking about cutting it from his preparation entirely. Race day told the rest of the story. Organisers brought the start forward by 3 hours because of a severe thunderstorm warning. Hamilton, starting 6th, wanted the rain. The rain did not come. He picked up light contact damage on the opening lap and spent the rest of the afternoon nursing a compromised car through the field. He crossed the line 7th, then got promoted to 6th after the stewards penalised Leclerc. 6th, from qualifying to checkered flag. The simulator weekend distilled into one result. That is a 7-time world champion, telling the most famous racing team on the planet that one of their core engineering tools is making him slower, and he will work around it himself. What makes Miami so frustrating is that Hamilton arrived believing the corner had been turned. The team had spent the week since Japan doing a deep dive into the straight-line power deficit that cost him nearly a second per lap in Suzuka. That investigation found the cause was not the engine itself, but multiple systems interacting badly, costing 8 to 9/10 on the straights. Ferrari had fixed it. Hamilton had been in the simulator and factory every week during the April break, training heavily, feeling fresher than at any point since joining Ferrari. The mathematics of Ferrari's situation are unforgiving. Mercedes leads the championship. To close the gap, Ferrari has to develop at double the rate of everyone else. If a rival team brings 1/10 of a second per lap, Ferrari needs 2. If they bring 2/10, Ferrari needs 3 or 4. Hamilton knows this, and he arrived in Miami believing the 11 new components would validate the progress. Then, Friday evening happened, and the cycle of doubt from 2025 started again. To understand why that carries the weight it does, you need to know what the last 14 months looked like from Hamilton's side of the garage. Hamilton's first season at Ferrari in 2025 was, by every available measurement, the worst of his entire Formula One career. Not a difficult adjustment or a transition period with expected growing pains. The worst. He finished 6th in the Drivers' Championship. He scored 0 Grand Prix podiums across 24 races. That had never happened before. Not once in 19 previous seasons across McLaren and Mercedes. His previous worst podium count was 3, back in 2009, when he was 24 years old and still learning how to manage a struggling McLaren. In 2025, at 40 years old, driving for the most iconic team in motorsport history, he could not crack the top 3 a single time on a Sunday afternoon. The qualifying gap to Leclerc was enormous, 5-19 across the full season. Hamilton beat his teammate in qualifying 5 times all year. The race head-to-head was nearly as lopsided, 3-18. Leclerc scored 242 points. Hamilton scored 156. Ferrari finished 4th in the constructors' standings behind McLaren, Mercedes and Red Bull. Individual weekends made the aggregate data feel generous. In China, Hamilton won the sprint from pole position, then got disqualified from the Grand Prix for excessive plank wear. His single genuine highlight of the year erased from the record books. At the British Grand Prix, his home race at Silverstone, the car's handling was so disconnected from his instincts that every corner felt like a slalom. At the Japanese Grand Prix in Suzuka, the car was losing 8 to 9 tenths on the straights through multiple systems interacting badly, a deficit nobody had caught in the simulator. By Las Vegas in November, Hamilton had reached his limit. 22 bad weekends. That was his summary of the season. Rumours began circulating that Max Verstappen could replace Hamilton at Ferrari for 2026. Vasseur denied it immediately. But the fact that the question was even being asked told you everything about how far things had fallen. The deeper problem is that the SF25 was deliberately built around Leclerc's driving style. Hamilton's driving style required the opposite of what the SF25 delivered, and when the technical team abandoned in-season development midway through the year to prioritise the 2026 car, Hamilton spent the second half of 2025 driving a frozen machine that was never designed for him. No upgrades coming, no fixes in the pipeline. Just a car that fought his instincts for 12 straight races. Hamilton recognised the pattern from his final Mercedes years. His instincts fought the data won. The results got worse. At Ferrari, he resolved to handle it differently. Miami is the moment that resolution went public. The early signs in 2026 had actually been encouraging. The new regulations brought a fundamentally different car, the SF26, and Hamilton found its handling characteristics more natural than the SF25 from the first laps. In Australia, he finished 4th. In China, he scored his first Ferrari Grand Prix podium at just his 26th attempt for the team. The car suited him, except the conversation between Hamilton and the simulator at Maranello still was not working. The real car felt right, the virtual car did not. And every setup that Ferrari prepared for race weekends started in the simulator before it ever reached the circuit. There is a reason this story keeps circling back to the simulator, and it is not because Hamilton has some grudge against technology. It is because Ferrari's simulation methodology has been a documented weak point since before Hamilton even arrived at Maranello. Ferrari runs a Dynisma simulator rig at its headquarters. It is the same class of hardware that Mercedes uses at Brackley. The physical equipment is not the issue. What makes a simulator useful or useless is the software running inside it. Specifically, the tyre modelling data and the correlation algorithms that make the virtual car on screen behave like the real car on a real circuit at real temperatures. If the tyre model does not accurately capture how a Pirelli compound degrades through a stint, or how the rubber generates heat under lateral load at 40 degrees of track surface temperature, then every setup recommendation the simulator produces is built on a flawed foundation. The driver spends days optimizing a car that behaves one way on screen and a completely different way on tarmac. And the cruel part is that the more time you spend perfecting a setup inside a broken simulator, the further you drive from the right answer. Hamilton spotted this disconnect almost immediately after joining Ferrari. In February 2025, barely a month into his time at Maranello, he privately flagged to the engineering staff that the simulator correlation felt wrong. He raised the concern internally. It was not acted upon. The irony of the situation cuts deep. When Hamilton first arrived at Ferrari in January 2025, the team's engineers deliberately ran him through a modified simulator program designed to overwrite his Mercedes sensory memory. They adjusted suspension calibrations, changed engine mapping profile, reconfigured the force feedback through the steering column. The stated goal was to reprogram 12 years of Mercedes muscle memory and replace it with a Ferrari baseline. Ferrari spent January training Hamilton to trust their simulator. Hamilton spent February telling them the simulator was wrong. The team kept developing the SF25 based on simulation data Hamilton did not believe in, and his results fell further behind Leclerc with every passing weekend. It took 10 months for someone at Maranello to act. In December 2025, Ferrari hired 2 simulation engineers directly from Mercedes. Shahid Farzand, a senior performance and simulation specialist whose particular expertise was tyre modelling, the exact discipline where the correlation was weakest. And Giulio Zoppini, an aerospace engineer from Brackley, technical director Leclerc, himself a former Mercedes engineer recruited by Vasseur, specifically to modernize Ferrari's methodology, brought both into the simulation department. The problem was identified inaccurate tyre input data, correlation software, less refined than what Mercedes had built. Ferrari acknowledged it. They hired people to fix it. Miami was the exam. 11 new components, the biggest aero upgrade package of the season. The first real test of whether Ferrari's simulator now told the truth. Hamilton's sixth-place qualifying says the fix is not complete, at least not for his side of the garage. And this is where the story gets significantly more interesting than a simple narrative about broken software. Charles Leclerc used the same simulator during the April break, ran the same correlation sessions at Maranello, arrived with the same 11 upgrades, and he qualified third, 2/10 ahead of Hamilton. On Saturday, while Hamilton was throwing out his setup and starting over, Leclerc was fine-tuning a car that already felt close to what the virtual version had predicted. In the race, Leclerc was running inside the podium positions for most of the afternoon. With 2 laps remaining, he pushed too hard at turn 3, lost the rear end, spun into the wall, and damaged his left front steering arm. He limped the car around the final lap, cutting 4 corners to get back to the pits. He crossed the line 6th. The stewards opened 3 separate investigations into his final lap alone and penalised him with a 20-second time penalty that dropped him to 8th. Both Ferrari drivers had miserable Sundays in Miami. Leclerc threw a genuine podium into the wall through his own misjudgment. Hamilton was never going to reach the podium because of where his weekend started. The difference that matters is what happened before Saturday. Leclerc's simulator-derived setup translated to the real circuit. Hamilton's did not. 2 completely different outputs for drivers sitting 10 meters apart in the same garage. What that gap reveals is straightforward. Ferrari's simulator has been trained around Leclerc's driving reference since 2019. 7 years of his inputs, his sensitivities, his instinctive responses forming the baseline the software knows. Hamilton's driving style is different enough that the same simulator produces accurate data for one driver and subtly misleading data for the other. This is not a conspiracy. This is how simulation engineering works. A model calibrated against driver A's physical inputs will naturally correlate better with driver A's real-world car behavior. Driver B gets a version of reality that is slightly off. And in Formula One, slightly off means 3 positions on the grid. No driver at Ferrari says publicly that he is thinking about abandoning the simulator without understanding how that lands inside Maranello. The internal culture prizes data-driven process. Sebastian Vettel's final years at Ferrari, from 2018 to 2020, were defined partly by this exact tension. A champion wanting to drive the car his way, colliding with a team that wanted him to follow the data. Hamilton is walking a similar path now, with one major difference. Ferrari's leadership is not resisting. Fred Vasseur stood by the upgrade package publicly, but did not contradict the simulator diagnosis. He left the criticism on the record. Leclerc, who recruited the Mercedes simulation engineers in December, is aligned with Hamilton's position. The tension is not about whether the problem exists. It is about how fast the fix can arrive while a championship is happening. There is a well-known principle inside the Formula One paddock about Hamilton. If he does not feel like the team's hero, he loses performance. That is not an insult. It is a description of how he operates. His greatest seasons came when the team's feedback loop was structured around his cockpit feel. When that loop disconnected, his results collapsed, even though his raw speed did not change. 2025 was a year where Ferrari collected Hamilton's feedback, noted it, and then overrode it with simulator data he did not trust. Miami 2026 is the moment he stopped tolerating that arrangement. The timing could not be worse. While Hamilton fights to recalibrate Ferrari's methodology, Mercedes is pulling away. Andrea Kimi Antonelli, 19 years old, won the Miami Grand Prix from pole position, his 3rd consecutive victory. He leads the 2026 championship. George Russell sits second. Mercedes read the rulebook more accurately than everyone else. Ferrari's development mathematics have not changed since the start of the season. To close the gap, Ferrari needs to bring double the gains of every rival, every race weekend. A 10th becomes 2, 2/10 becomes 4. And Mercedes is expected to bring another major upgrade package to Canada in 2 weeks. The hill gets steeper while Ferrari is still recalibrating the tools it uses to climb. There is another detail from Miami that the headline coverage has mostly overlooked. The front wing. Mercedes, McLaren, and Red Bull all run a fundamentally different front wing design concept to Ferrari. All 3 teams running that concept have improved relative to Ferrari this year. Whether that explains the performance gap is unclear, but the question is now on Ferrari's engineering desk. That is a 41-year-old driver doing competitor aerodynamic analysis after qualifying while the rest of the paddock is still digesting the timing sheet. Between the simulator rejection, the front wing investigation, and the overnight setup rebuild, Miami 2026 paints a clear picture of a driver who is done waiting for the system to come to him. He is pulling the engineering direction toward himself, and Vasseur and Serra are letting it happen. Hamilton's simulator complaint points at something bigger than one team's internal struggle. Every team on the grid builds its development pipeline through simulation. Wind tunnel hours are capped by the regulations. On-track testing barely exists. The simulator is where the vast majority of setup work happens between races. When the simulation matches reality, teams arrive ready. When it does not, they burn practice time chasing a baseline they should have brought from the factory. Ferrari has the budget. Ferrari has the engineering talent. Ferrari even has the right simulator hardware. What they are still fixing, 14 months after Hamilton first raised the alarm, is the methodology that turns all of that investment into a car that matches what a 7-time world champion feels beneath him on a real circuit surface. Canada is in 2 weeks. Mercedes brings more upgrades. The development gap could widen before Ferrari has any chance to shrink it. And Lewis Hamilton, 41 years old, is telling Maranello that the answer is not inside the computer. It is on the track. It is in the tyres, in the steering wheel, in 20 years of knowing exactly when a car is telling the truth and when it is lying to him.